Welcome to History's Chronicles of Horror. Tonight, we don't look for monsters in haunted castles or shadowy forests. We look for them on a throne. In the blood-soaked theater of 16th century England, one man's ego became a weapon of mass destruction. King Henry VIII. His name conjures images of a bloated, terrifying figure, a monarch whose appetites, for power, for women, for absolute control, were insatiable. He could shatter 1,000 years of faith with a stroke of his pen, bend parliaments to his whim, and command the death of any man, woman, or child in his kingdom. His freedom seemed absolute, his power a monstrous parody of the divine. But this isn't just his story. At the very same moment Henry's power reached its terrifying apex, another man sat in a cold, lightless cell in the Tower of London, a place where stone walls sweat fear. This man had nothing. His name was Thomas More. Once the king's most trusted friend, he was now his most famous prisoner. He'd been stripped of his titles, his vast wealth, his home, and his freedom. And yet, a chilling argument can be made that this man, shackled and awaiting a gruesome death, was freer than the tyrant who had locked him away. This is the horrifying story of a moral conviction so strong it revealed the true nature of cages. It is the story of a mind that no monarch could conquer, a soul that soared over stone walls and iron bars, leaving a timeless, terrifying question in its wake. What is the true price of your soul? How can a man in chains be freer than a king on his throne? How can a condemned prisoner possess something a monarch craves but can never truly hold? To answer that, we must descend into the gilded cage of the Tudor court, a world of deadly splendor and whispering paranoia. We must go back to a time before the monster was fully formed, to the friendship between a young, brilliant king and the one man he considered his intellectual and spiritual equal. For before Thomas More was Henry VIII's victim, he was his confidant, his mentor, his friend. Theirs was a bond forged in the bright, optimistic fire of the Renaissance. Its tragic, bloody end would not just plunge a kingdom into a new age of terror, but would expose the rot at the heart of absolute power. It forces us to stare into the abyss and ask, is a man's worth measured by the power he wields over others, or by the brutal, terrifying power he must hold over himself? To truly grasp the horror of what happened, you must first understand the idyllic lie that came before it. You must see the sunlight before the endless night. The early reign of Henry VIII was a world away from the grotesque, tyrannical image that history has burned into our minds. This was a young king, dazzling in his brilliance, a true Renaissance prince. He was athletic, a fearsome Jew-stir, a composer of haunting music, a writer of passionate poetry, and a fierce theological debater. And in this vibrant, dangerous court, he found what he believed to be a kindred spirit, Thomas More. More wasn't born to the ancient, land-owning nobility, but his intellect was its own, far superior form of aristocracy. He was a lawyer of breathtaking skill, a celebrated humanist scholar whose mind danced with the greatest thinkers of the age, and a man whose integrity seemed forged from steel. His masterwork, Utopia, published in 1516, was an intellectual sensation across Europe. It was a witty, devastatingly clever, and philosophical exploration of an ideal society, a testament to a mind that dared to dream of a better, more just world. It was everything the young Henry aspired to be. The king was utterly captivated. He saw in More not a servant, but a reflection of his own best self. He relished More's sharp, dangerous wit and his profound wisdom. Theirs was not the stiff, formal relationship of a monarch and a subject. It was a genuine, intimate friendship. The king would often arrive at More's home in Chelsea, unannounced, a shocking breach of royal protocol. He'd dismiss his entourage and spend hours walking with More in his garden, arm in arm, his head tilted towards his friend, discussing everything from the movement of the planets to the nature of God's will, gazing up at the stars. More was one of the few men alive who could speak truthfully to the king, whose counsel Henry seemed to not just value, but need. Henry's admiration was a torrent, both personal and professional. He dragged More up through the ranks of government, making him a privy councillor, knighting him, and elevating him to Speaker of the House of Commons. More became a key advisor, a trusted diplomat, the king's man in the highest circles of power. Then, In 1529, after the spectacular, ruinous fall of the all-powerful Cardinal Wolsey, Henry made the ultimate gesture of trust. He appointed Thomas More as Lord Chancellor of England. This was the highest judicial office in the kingdom, a position of almost unimaginable power. And for the first time, it was held not by a high-ranking bishop, but by a layman. It was a testament to the king's boundless faith in his friend. More, a man of almost painful diligence and scrupulous fairness, threw himself into the role, working tirelessly for the king he loved and the justice he served. A golden age seemed to stretch before them, a perfect partnership of power and principle. But a storm was gathering. A sickness was growing in the king's private chambers, a deeply personal, dynastic obsession that would soon be known as the king's great matter. It was a cancer of the will, a creeping dread that would metastasize, devouring their friendship, their kingdom, and countless lives. The sunlit garden walks were about to be replaced by the shadow of the axe. The crisis that would redefine England, that would turn a king into a tyrant, began with a primal, animal fear, the terror of being forgotten. By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades. Catherine, a woman of profound dignity and faith, had endured a nightmarish series of pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Only one child had survived the crucible of the royal nursery, a daughter, Mary. For Henry, this was not just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic catastrophe. His father, Henry VII, had clawed his way to the crown through the charnel house of the Wars of the Roses. The Tudor claim to the throne was still perceived as fragile, written in blood, and maintained by fear. A female ruler was virtually unprecedented in England, and the very idea was seen by the powerful men of the realm as a guarantee of weakness, instability, and a bloody return to civil war. The kingdom, Henry believed, would tear itself apart. Henry, a man of deep but terrifyingly convenient piety, became obsessed, convinced that his marriage was cursed by God. He found his justification in the Old Testament, in a passage from Leviticus that seemed to scream at him from the page. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Catherine had been, for a few brief months, married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before his untimely death. A special papal dispensation had been granted at the time to allow Henry to marry his brother's widow, but now, the king saw it not as a holy exception, but as the source of his divine punishment. The lack of sons was not bad luck, it was God's judgment, a holy curse upon his house. This theological anxiety, festering in the king's mind, was then fanned into an inferno by a new force in his life, Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to the queen, and was no gentle rose. She was a hawk, captivating, fiercely intelligent, and burning with ambition. She snared the king's obsessive attention. Henry, accustomed to taking what he wanted, became utterly infatuated. And played a game no one had dared play with him before. She refused to be his mistress. She would be his queen, or she would be nothing. This sealed Henry's fate, and the fate of his kingdom. His primal need for a son and his all-consuming lust for and merged into a single, monstrous obsession. He had to annul his marriage to Catherine. It was no longer a desire, it was a necessity. He appealed to Pope Clement VII in Rome, expecting, as a powerful and faithful king, a swift and favorable decision. But he had catastrophically misjudged the political landscape. The Pope was not a free agent. He was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner. The city of Rome had been brutally sacked by the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V was none other than Catherine of Aragon's powerful, protective nephew. There was absolutely no possibility that the Pope would grant an annulment that would so profoundly dishonor the emperor's aunt. The negotiations dragged on for years, a humiliating, infuriating ordeal for a man like Henry. His chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, who had promised him the world, failed spectacularly to secure the annulment. Wolsey was stripped of his power, his wealth, his dignity, and died in disgrace on his way to face the king's wrath. The great matter had reached a horrifying stalemate. Henry, a man who had never been denied anything of consequence in his entire life, was trapped. His ego, his legacy, his desires, his very sense of self were being thwarted by a foreign priest. It was in this crucible of supreme frustration and wounded, screaming pride that a new, radical, and terrifying idea began to take shape, whispered into his ear by ambitious, ruthless reformist counselors like Thomas Cromwell. If the Pope will not give the king what he wants, then the Pope will no longer matter. The authority of God on earth would be bent to the will of the King of England. As Lord Chancellor, Thomas More found himself standing at the epicenter of the coming earthquake. The ground was already trembling beneath his feet. When he accepted the great office, he did so on one desperate condition: that he would not have to be involved in the king's great matter. Henry, still wearing the mask of a reasonable friend, had agreed. It was a promise made to be broken. More was, above all things, a man of deep, unshakable, and terrified faith. He was a loyal servant to his king, but he knew with every fiber of his being that his ultimate allegiance was to God and to the single, universal Catholic Church, with the Pope as its head. For him, the idea that a secular ruler, a mere man of flesh and blood, could declare himself master of the spiritual realm was not a political disagreement. It was a blasphemy. It was the screaming mouth of hell opening up beneath England. As Henry's policies, driven by his obsession, grew more radical, More's position became a form of slow torture. He watched, with a sick feeling of dread, as the king, now guided by the cold, calculating mind of Thomas Cromwell, began to systematically dismantle the authority of the Pope in England. It was a masterclass in controlled demolition. Parliament was pressured, bullied, and threatened into passing a series of acts that chipped away, piece by piece, at the foundations of Roman authority. The final, terrifying blow came when the English clergy were forced to acknowledge the king as their supreme head, albeit with a temporary, face-saving clause that meant nothing, as far as the law of Christ allows. More could see where this was heading. It was a staircase leading down into a very dark room. He tried to walk a razor's edge, performing his public duties with his usual diligence, while keeping his personal opinions on the great matter locked away in a prison of silence. He was scrupulously loyal in all other aspects of his service, but on the matter of the king's marriage, he could not, in good conscience, lend his voice or his name. He refused to sign a threatening letter from English nobles to the Pope. As the pressure mounted, as the king's gaze grew colder, he repeatedly tried to resign his post, to simply be allowed to disappear. The friendship that had once been a source of intellectual joy was now a source of immense, suffocating strain. Henry, who had once cherished More's honesty, now demanded something far more sinister: absolute, unquestioning obedience. He didn't just want More's compliance, he wanted his public approval. The king knew that More was one of the most respected men in Europe. His endorsement would be a powerful stamp of legitimacy on Henry's increasingly tyrannical actions. It was the one thing More could not give. To give it would be to trade his soul for his life. The breaking point wasn't a single, dramatic confrontation. It was a slow, agonizing separation, like a body being torn apart. More saw a king he had loved and admired transforming into a monster, a man willing to rip apart the 1,000-year-old fabric of Christendom simply to satisfy his own will. Henry saw a friend and servant who, in his moment of greatest need, was withholding his loyalty, an act of supreme betrayal. The warmth between them curdled into suspicion and fear. The long, friendly walks in the garden became a distant, mocking memory, replaced by tense, chilling meetings and a growing, unspoken chasm between two men on a collision course with destiny. The king wanted to be the master of his kingdom. More believed there were some things, the human soul, the law of God, that no king had the right to command. The point of no return. The moment the abyss opened. It came in 1534. After years of legal maneuvering, political threats, and psychological warfare, Henry VIII and his enforcer, Thomas Cromwell, made their final, world-shattering move. The English Parliament, now little more than a collection of terrified men rubber-stamping the king's will, passed the monumental act of supremacy. This was no longer a subtle chipping away at papal influence. This was a seismic shattering of it. The act formally and terrifyingly declared that King Henry VIII, and all his successors, was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. It severed every last tie with Rome and placed the spiritual authority of the Pope, an authority believed to be handed down from St. Peter himself, squarely in the hands of the English monarch. The king was now Pope. The king was now God's chosen vessel. The king's will was now divine law. To enforce this new reality, a second, more openly vicious law was passed, the Treason Act. This act turned words into capital crimes. It made it an offense punishable by the most gruesome death imaginable to maliciously wish, will, or desire, by words or writing, to deny the king his new title. To give these acts teeth, an oath was devised. All of the king's subjects, when commanded, would have to swear to uphold the act of succession. This oath not only affirmed in Boleyn's children as the legitimate heirs to the throne, but implicitly, cunningly, contained within it an acceptance of the king's supremacy over the church, the very power that made the new marriage possible. It was a poison pill wrapped in a loyalty test. For Thomas More, this was the final, horrifying test. It was one thing to remain silent and pray for deliverance. It was another thing entirely to be compelled to actively, verbally, and under a holy oath, affirm something he believed to be a damnable heresy, an act that would condemn his immortal soul to eternal fire. He could, as a matter of law, accept the political reality of Anne Boleyn as queen and her children as heirs. That was a matter for Parliament and the king. But he could not, under any circumstances, swear an oath that repudiated the authority of the Pope. To do so, in his mind, was not merely to lie, but to jeopardize my soul to perpetual damnation. The stakes could not have been higher, and they were written in blood across the country. Friars who refused the oath were not just executed, they were made into public spectacles of horror. They were hanged until barely conscious, cut down, disemboweled while still alive, their entrails burned before their eyes, and their bodies hacked into 4 pieces. A visionary nun, Elizabeth Barton, was executed for the crime of prophesying the king's death if he married Anne. Henry VIII was demonstrating in the most brutal, terrifying terms that there was no room for dissent. You were either with him, body and soul, or you were a traitor destined for the butcher's block. The law, as one contemporary grimly put it, was now a two-edged sword. If More spoke out against it, he would be butchered for treason. If he swore the oath and assented to it, he believed he would face the eternal death of his soul. There was no escape. Faced with this impossible, terrifying choice, More took the only path his conscience would allow. On May 16, 1532, even before the final, monstrous act of supremacy was passed, but after the clergy had submitted to the king's authority in an act of mass cowardice, he took a stand by taking a step back. Citing failing health, a convenient fiction for a soul in torment, he resigned from his post as Lord Chancellor. This was a momentous, shocking act. He was surrendering the highest office in the land, a position of immense power, prestige, and wealth. He was willingly stepping away from the center of the world, retreating into the precarious quiet of his private life. It was an act of profound defiance, but it was not loud. That was not More's way. He was a lawyer to his very bones, and he understood the terrifying power of silence. He hoped, perhaps prayed, that by simply removing himself from the equation, by refusing to comment one way or the other, he could protect himself and his family. He would not swear the oath, but he would not speak against the king either. He believed he could find shelter in a subtle legal argument, that the law could not compel a man to reveal his inmost thoughts, and that silence, legally, implied consent. It was a brilliant, principled, and ultimately doomed stand. In Henry's increasingly paranoid and bloodthirsty court, subtlety was a luxury no one could afford. Silence was not consent, it was suspicion. The personal cost was immediate and brutal. Without the immense salary of the chancellorship, his income plummeted. He, a man who had lived in splendor, had to sell off his possessions and live a life of stark modesty. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to the true cost. He had lost the king's favor, which in Tudor England was akin to losing the sun's warmth, plunging his entire world into a deadly chill. He sealed his fate when he made a point of refusing to attend the lavish coronation of Anne Boleyn in 1533. It was a public snub Henry could not miss and would never forgive. It was a clear, though silent, scream of his disapproval. More tried to find peace in his home, with his books and his beloved family, but the shadow of the king's displeasure was a physical presence, a cold spot in every room. Thomas Cromwell, the king's new favorite, a man of ruthless efficiency and no discernible conscience, saw More's silence not as piety, but as a dangerous, living challenge to the king's authority. More was too famous, too beloved, too respected throughout Christendom. His silent refusal to endorse the king's new role was a glaring indictment that undermined the very legitimacy of the new order. Cromwell and the king would not let him simply fade away. They needed his submission, his public, humiliating submission, and if they couldn't get it, they would utterly destroy him. The hunt had begun. The trap was finally sprung on April 13, 1534. A summons arrived. Thomas More was to present himself at Lambeth Palace and formally swear the oath of succession. He walked there with his son-in-law, William Roper. As they went, More, having already fought and won the war within his own soul, turned to Roper and reportedly said with a terrifying calm, "Son Roper, I thank our Lord the field is won." He had made his peace with the inevitable. He would not break. Before the king's commissioners, a panel of grim-faced men including Thomas Cromwell and the new Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer, More laid out his impossible position. He would accept the part of the oath that named his children as heirs to the throne. That was politics. But he would not, could not, swear to the preamble, which contained the poison, the repudiation of papal authority. His refusal, as calm and reasoned as it was a death sentence. It was an act of high treason in the eyes of the new state. 4 days later, on April 17th, Thomas More was arrested and taken by river to the Tower of London. The Tower was not just a prison. It was England's most notorious political tomb, a grim fortress of stone and shadow that had been the final, terrifying home for generations of the king's enemies. More was confined to a cell in the bell tower. His former rank afforded him slightly better conditions than a common prisoner, but it was still a living hell. The cell was cold, damp, and filled with the ghosts of the condemned. His health, already fragile, began to fail, but the most exquisite torture was his separation from his cherished family. The psychological warfare was relentless and cruel. Thomas Cromwell visited him repeatedly, the mask of friendship long gone, now an interrogator trying to persuade, cajole, and threaten him into submission. During these sessions, More clung to his legal shield of silence. He would not speak against the supremacy, but he would not affirm it. He insisted, again and again, that he was the king's loyal subject and meant no harm, a legalistic defense against a power that no longer cared for law. His family was allowed occasional visits, encounters that were weapons of torment. His beloved eldest daughter, Margaret, known as Meg, was his intellectual equal and the keeper of his heart. Cromwell, in a stroke of calculated cruelty, allowed her to visit, hoping she could break her father's will and make him save his own life. These meetings were heart-wrenching. Meg and the rest of his family, terrified for him, had taken the oath. They begged him, weeping, to do the same. They could not understand why he would choose this path of agony, why he would throw away his life and devastate his family over a point of principle that so many other great men had readily accepted. He felt the pain his decision was causing them like a physical blow, yet his conviction remained unshaken. He believed that fidelity to his conscience, to God's eternal law, was a duty that superseded even his profound, aching love for his family. He was being asked to choose between two different kinds of damnation. It was here, in the grim, suffocating confines of his tower cell, that Thomas More forged his greatest weapon. For a time, he was allowed books and writing materials. He used them not to rage against his fate, not to pen pleas for mercy, but to stare into the abyss of his own suffering and write its meaning. He wrote a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, a masterpiece of Christian humanism composed while living under the constant, gnawing threat of a traitor's death. The book is a fictional conversation, a clever veil for More's own torment. It is set between an uncle, Anthony, and his nephew, Vincent, in Hungary, as they faced the terrifying threat of an Ottoman invasion. This setting was a thin disguise for More's own situation, a deep, harrowing meditation on how to find solace and hope in the face of overwhelming persecution and certain death. Through this dialogue, More laid out the terrifying philosophy that was sustaining him. He argued that tribulation, suffering, is not a sign of God's disfavor, but is often a gracious gift, a bitter medicine for the soul. True freedom, he contended with chilling clarity, is not found in the absence of physical walls, but in the liberation of the soul that comes from accepting God's will. In a profound, terrifying sense, he argued, All people are prisoners, prisoners of their mortal bodies, their worldly desires, their fears. The only true liberty is spiritual, a freedom earned through suffering. The book is an extraordinary window into the mind of a man transforming his own agony into a testament of faith. Far from being crushed by his ordeal, More found a strange, unearthly sense of peace. In a letter to his daughter Meg, he wrote with a serenity that borders on the insane, "For methinketh God mocketh me a wanton, and setteth me on his lap, and damneth me." He saw his imprisonment not as a punishment from the king, but as God treating him like a cherished child, testing his faith to its absolute limit to bring him closer. But Cromwell's patience was not infinite. In a final, brutal effort to break his mind, the order was given. His books, his ink, his paper, they were all taken away. He was left in the dark, with nothing but the cold stone and his own thoughts. Yet, More's spirit remained unyielding. He had built an intellectual and spiritual fortress within his own mind, a space of absolute freedom that his captors could not touch, could not even comprehend. While King Henry sat on his throne, increasingly a paranoid slave to his passions and his fears, executing those closest to him, Thomas More sat in a dark cell, a prisoner who had found a form of liberty that no king could take away. The state had stripped him of everything, but it could not strip him of himself. After more than a year of imprisonment had failed to break his will, the crown decided it had no other choice. If his mind could not be broken, his body would be. On July 1st, 1535, Sir Thomas More was brought to Westminster Hall to stand trial for high treason. The man who appeared was a ghost of his former self, so weakened by his long confinement that he had to support his frail body with a staff. But witnesses from the day described his face as cheerful and composed, a sight that must have been deeply unsettling to his accusers. Before him sat a panel of judges, a gallery of the most powerful men in England, including the new Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, and the architect of his destruction, Thomas Cromwell himself. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. This was not a trial. It was a piece of theater designed to give a legal gloss to a state-sanctioned murder. The jury was there for appearances only. The only challenge for the prosecution was to construct a plausible legal case against a man whose primary crime was his refusal to speak. The indictment laid out 4 flimsy charges: that he had shown malice by remaining silent, that he had corresponded with Bishop John Fisher, another prisoner of conscience, to conspire against the king, that he had called the act of supremacy a two-edged sword, and that he had actively denied the king's supremacy. More, his brilliant legal mind still sharp as a shard of glass, easily dismantled the first 3. He argued that having an opinion was not treason, that his letters with Fisher were merely personal notes of encouragement, and that his two-edged sword comment was simply an accurate description of his horrifying legal dilemma, not an act of malice. On the charge of silence, he powerfully invoked a legal maxim: Cataset consentire videtur, he who is silent seems to consent. For this my silence, he argued with devastating logic, neither your law nor any law in the world is able justly and rightly to punish me. Cromwell and the prosecution were stymied. Their case was collapsing against the intellectual fortress of the defendant. To secure the conviction they so desperately needed, they had to cheat. They needed a lie, and they found their liar in the person of Richard Rich. Rich was the Solicitor General, an ambitious and utterly unscrupulous man whose career More had once refused to advance, judging him to be a man of poor and dangerous character. Now, Rich was the prosecution's star witness. He was called to the stand and testified under holy oath that, during a visit to More's cell to remove his books, he had engaged More in a hypothetical conversation. Rich claimed that during this talk, More had cast aside his year of careful silence and explicitly denied that Parliament had the authority to make the king the head of the church. It was a blatant, soul-destroying lie, an act of pure perjury designed to give the court the malicious words it needed to kill a man. More was aghast, not at his own danger, but at the damnation of the liar. He turned to the court and delivered a devastating rebuke. "In good faith, Mr. Rich, I am more sorry for your perjury than for my own peril," he declared. He reminded the court of Rich's well-known reputation as a liar, a gossip, and a gambler, asking them how likely it was that he, Thomas More, who had not even confided his true thoughts to his own wife or his beloved daughter, would suddenly reveal the secrets of his conscience to a man like Richard Rich, a man he knew to be a walking cesspit of ambition. But it was no use. The truth did not matter. Rich's testimony, however false, was the nail they needed for his coffin. Two other men who were in the cell at the time were called to the stand. Conveniently, they both claimed they had been busy packing books and hadn't heard the conversation. The lie stood, uncontested by cowards. Rich had traded his soul for political power. The jury, without even bothering to retire for more than a few minutes, delivered the inevitable verdict: guilty. Thomas More's fate was sealed by a calculated lie, his life forfeit to the ambition of a lesser man and the paranoia of a tyrant. Before we witness the final, chilling act of this story of incredible conviction, take a moment to consider the stakes. If you believe these dark chronicles from history hold vital, terrifying lessons for our own time, and want to support the deep research that goes into unearthing them, please subscribe to History's Chronicles of Horror and turn on notifications. It ensures you won't miss our future explorations into the monsters who have shaped our world. The sentence for high treason was the most brutal punishment the law allowed: to be taken from the court, hanged by the neck until almost dead, cut down, and then, while still alive, to be disemboweled and have his entrails burned before his face. Finally, his body was to be hacked into 4 quarters. King Henry, in a final, grotesque act of mercy for his former friend, commuted this symphony of agony to a simple beheading. Once the sentence was passed, the game was over. The legal battle was lost. More, the man who had so carefully, so painfully guarded his tongue for over a year, was finally free to speak his mind. And he did so with a power and clarity that stunned the courtroom into silence. No longer bound by the need to defend himself within the twisted logic of the king's law, he now stood on the higher, unassailable ground of divine law. He told the judges to their faces that the indictment was grounded on an act of parliament that was an abomination, directly repugnant to the law of God and his holy church. He argued that no temporal ruler could ever presume to have authority over the spiritual realm, and that this new law violated not only the entire history of Christianity, but also the Magna Carta and the king's own coronation oath. When the Lord Chancellor countered that all the bishops, nobles, and universities in the kingdom had accepted the act, More delivered a truly universal and terrifying perspective. He replied that for every bishop who accepted it in England, he had on his side 100 saints. He declared that when considering all of Christendom, not just one small, frightened realm, the vast majority, the Council of Christendom, supported the traditional faith. It was a breathtaking intellectual defiance, a final testament from one of the greatest minds of his age, delivered from the threshold of his own grave. His final words in the court were not of anger or bitterness, but of an extraordinary, unsettling grace that must have chilled his accusers to the bone. He looked upon the men who had just condemned him to death, Cromwell, Audley, Rich, and the others, and expressed a hope. He prayed that, just as St. Paul had held the coats of those who stoned St. Stephen to death, yet was now with him in paradise, so I shall right heartily pray, that though your lordships have now here on earth been judges to my condemnation, we may yet hereafter in heaven merrily all meet together, to our everlasting salvation. It was a moment of profound moral victory. They had condemned his body, but he had just condemned their souls. As he was led from the court back to the tower, an axe carried before him with its blade turned towards him to signify his condemnation. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a martyr in the making. The end came in the gray, pre-dawn light of July 6, 1535. Sir Thomas Pope, an old acquaintance, arrived at More's cell. He brought the news that More was to be executed before 9 o'clock that morning. More thanked him heartily for the good tidings, as if being told of a great honor. "I am much bounden to the king's grace," he said, his voice steady, "for the benefits and honors that he hath still from time to time heaped upon me. And yet more bound I am to his grace that it pleaseth him so shortly to rid me from the miseries of this wretched world." He was led out of the tower, his beard long and white, his face pale and gaunt from his ordeal, clutching a red cross in his hand. The short journey to the execution site on Tower Hill was his final, earthly pilgrimage. On the way, a woman in the crowd offered him a cup of wine. He refused it, saying, "My master had gall and vinegar, not wine, given him to drink." Then, he encountered his daughter Meg one last, soul-shattering time. She broke through the line of guards, ignoring their pikes, and threw her arms around her father's neck, kissing him again and again, unable to speak through her silent, racking sobs. He held her and comforted her, telling her to have patience and to accept God's will, a father comforting his child on the edge of his own grave. On the scaffold, he displayed a composure and even a dark, unnerving wit that has become the stuff of legend. The structure was rickety and poorly built. As he approached the steps, he turned to the lieutenant and said with a slight smile, "I pray you, Master Lieutenant, see me safe up, and for my coming down, let me shift for myself." The king had sent a message, requesting he keep his final speech brief to avoid stirring up the crowd. More honored this. He asked the assembled people to pray for him, and to bear witness with me that I shall now suffer death in and for the faith of the Holy Catholic Church. Then came the immortal words that have echoed through history, the perfect, chilling encapsulation of his entire life and his horrific struggle. He declared to the silent crowd that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. He knelt to pray. When the executioner, as was the custom, knelt and asked for his forgiveness, More rose and kissed him on the cheek. "Pluck up thy spirits, man," he said gently, "and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short. Take heed therefore that thou strike not awry, for saving of thine honesty." In a final, bizarrely humorous and deeply human gesture, as he laid his head upon the chopping block, he carefully moved his long beard out of the path of the axe, remarking, "Pity that should be cut, that has not committed treason." With one swing of the heavy axe, it was over. His head was held up to the crowd, then taken to be parboiled and impaled on a spike on London Bridge, a grisly, silent warning to any who would dare defy the king. As legend holds, his daughter Margaret later bribed a guard to take it down. She preserved the skull for the rest of her life, a horrifying, sacred relic of her father's love and sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath, it seemed Henry had won. He had his new wife. He had his new church. He had his male heir on the way. He had absolute, terrifying power. But the execution of a man as widely beloved and respected as Thomas More sent a shockwave of horror across Europe. It irrevocably marked a turning point in Henry's reign, the moment the charismatic Renaissance prince completed his final, horrifying descent into the paranoid, blood-soaked tyrant of popular imagination. He would go on to execute and Boleyn on fabricated charges, just as he had done with More. He would execute Thomas Cromwell, the man who had helped him get everything he wanted. Wives, friends, advisors, they would all fall before his insatiable paranoia. He got everything he wanted, but it brought him no peace, only more blood and more fear. Thomas More, by contrast, had lost everything: his status, his wealth, his family, his life. But in death, his legacy only grew. He was seen instantly as a martyr, not just for his specific Catholic faith, but for the universal, terrifying principle of individual conscience against the crushing, monolithic power of the state. He had refused to allow any earthly authority, even a king he had once loved as a brother, to command his soul. In the centuries that followed, his story would inspire dissidents, prisoners of conscience, and rebels against tyranny everywhere. He was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church 400 years after his death, and is honored today as the patron saint of statesmen and politicians, a chilling reminder of the price of integrity. And so we return to the terrifying paradox we began with: the prisoner who was freer than the king. Henry VIII had the freedom of a monarch, the power to do anything he desired. He could take any wife, seize any land, rewrite God's law, and kill any man who stood in his way. Yet he was a slave to his anxieties about his dynasty, a slave to his lusts, a slave to the ever-growing paranoia that led him to butcher those who loved him. His world grew ever smaller, walled in by the prison of his own fear and suspicion. His power was immense, but it could not grant him control over the one thing that mattered most: the screaming chaos of his own mind. Thomas More, in his final months, had his physical freedom annihilated. He was confined to a single, cold room, his body broken, his future a certainty of violent death. But in that very confinement, he found a different, more profound, and more terrifying kind of liberty. By refusing to betray his own conscience, He liberated his soul from the tyranny of fear. He had mastered himself. He faced the ultimate worldly power with nothing but his own moral conviction, and he did not yield. His body was captive, but his spirit was unbound. The story of Thomas More and Henry VIII leaves us with a question that echoes from their graves. It forces us to look into our own hearts and ask what freedom truly means. Is it the power to impose your will on the world, or the integrity to be true to yourself, no matter the cost? The life and death of Thomas More suggests a chilling answer. He reminds us that the walls of a prison are nothing compared to the prison of a compromised soul. And he leaves us with one final, haunting thought to carry away into the night. What, really, is a conviction worth if it doesn't cost you anything?